and welcome to the Paranormalist Podcast. I'm your co-host, Stu, and I'm here with the paranormalist herself, Patty Wilson. Patty, how are you doing today?
I am doing just fine. How are you?
I'm doing not too well. We just had a little conversation before we started here, and I almost went into a coughing fit because I was laughing so much. But if you are just joining us, we thank you very, very much for finding us. Please consider subscribing, click the like. Everything else about the Paranormalist Podcast you'll find in the description. And with that, I think I'm going to ask, what's our topic for today?
Okay. So tonight's topic is 7 hauntings you should know but don't. And I'm going to put a caveat.
Oh, okay.
Depending on how long they take, we might finish them up next week. And if that's the case, I might even add one.
All
But
right. Well, I will listen as fast as I can.
nope, that's fine. But these are some of the best haunting stories I know, or just there's something that's really different about them. And I wanted to share them. And we're going to start way back in history. And I might have talked about this before, but it fits this category. So it's going to be the lead. But you're going to hear some stories I know you've never heard before coming up. So this took place in 1799 in Sullivan, Maine. And I have to tell you, there were 30 some eyewitness accounts collected by a local minister of the events that were going on. So there was a gentleman by the name of Abraham Cummings. He was an itinerant minister. So for those who don't know, back in the 1700s, if you didn't have your own church, then you were an itinerant minister, and you would go from area to area having revivals and, preaching. And then people would pay you, their tithe would be your salary for that night's work. And so this is how he came to be in that space. But he lingered for quite a while because he was fascinated with this crazy story that I'm about to tell you. So in Sullivan, Maine in 1799, there was this young woman who had actually died in 1796, 3 years before the series of events that I'm going to tell you about. So she had died in childbirth, and as he comes into the town, he begins to hear these stories. Several people from Sullivan claimed that over the last few months they had seen her, or better, more perfectly, her spirit. And you have to understand, in this time frame, seeing the ghosts and talking about it was not the norm. So he was a little rattled at first by it. And basically what they said is that her and her husband had lived in a place called the Blaisdell House out near Taunton Bay, which is right by where he was at. And that she appeared to the family in the house, in the basement. And she told the family member to go and get witnesses. And so rattled, the person went and got somebody to come in and see what was going on. And to their surprise, there stood Nellie Butler, this young lady who had died at about the age of 22, I think it was, or 23. And she began to hold court in the basement in the evenings.
Oh.
And people would come from far and wide. It spread everywhere. And she was answering questions and including personal, private things that not a stranger would know. And then it just got even more insane. So one of the things that she wanted was she wanted her husband to remarry, and she wanted him to remarry the young girl who lived near to them, who was 15. Now, he would have been about 25, and
Yeah, different times. Yeah.
different times. I mean, it just was. People married much younger back then. And she went on a push to, tell them that they need to get married. But along that journey, she also did a lot of other things. And so for off and on for this few months, she appears in the basement. People come, they're all chatting. Like I said, the pastor hears of all of this, and the first person he interviews is a woman by the name of Mary Gordon. And she said At first, the apparition was a mere mass of light, then grew into personal form, about as tall as myself. Um, we stood in two ranks, about 4 or 5 apart. Between these ranks, she slowly passed and repassed, so that any of us could have handled her. At least the personal form became shapeless then and expanded in every way and then vanished in a moment. And he said so many people saw the same thing and reported the same story that he felt compelled to stay and document this. And so there are some people who believe that the story was really embellished by a professor um, in the 1940s named Marcus Labrizzi. And he, because he would then take these notes from this minister who had been long dead, and the notes had fallen into obscurity. He found them, and he supposedly wrote a book about this. But it's really interesting because he also was able to prove, he found out where George Butler was buried, that Nellie Butler was real. They found the cemetery where they were both laid to rest. He found other documentation that indicates the story was very much true. And Nellie Butler, as I said, continued to push and push for for her husband to marry. Now, because of the meddling nature of this spirit, some people began to get very suspicious that this wasn't a good thing. However, the minister would write in this rapturous way about how this is an angelic being from God. And this entity, whatever she was, would literally preach sermons in the basement and expound on religious texts, as well as answer personal questions. I mean, there is something happening. Like, she's down there sometimes for an hour or two with 12 or 15 people with her. And eventually she does succeed in convincing everyone that this young lady should marry her husband. And as soon as they get married, like literally the day of, she appears at the Blaisdell house on the first floor for the very first time, because she had always appeared in the basement and they were married in his home. So that was the Blaisdell house. And tells this young woman and the whole company that she will have a child, but like me, she will die in childbirth. And then she's gone. And you can imagine what that must have been like for everybody there, because like this is supposed to be a happy occasion and this is what she's been lobbying for. And that doesn't make any sense. If you knew this was what was going to happen, why would you encourage it? And what have you. So some people in town begin to talk a lot more negatively, and they're saying, no, she's not an angel at all. She was pretending to be Nellie Butler. She was pretending to be an angelic being, but she's a demonic spirit. And then they began to turn their back to Lydia, the young woman he married, the 15-year-old girl. So some people are like, this was a trick and Lydia did it. Lydia had always had her cap pinned for the neighbor man. And then they started saying she was a witch if it wasn't fraud. So one way or the other, it was her fault. Then her family becomes ostracized because, of course, they're trying to stand up for her because, this is the 1790s and, bad stuff happens to people. And it had happened not so far in the past that they'd forgotten about it. And at that point, when it starts to really come down on Lydia, I don't understand it, but Nellie suddenly reappears and she gets angry at the people for speaking against this girl, Lydia. And she suddenly becomes this, they call it a phantasmal creature of the Lord, singing alleluias and chasing down the skeptics. That August, large groups of people gathered at the Blaisdell cellar to listen to the ghost speak on religious topics. During that time, the apparition openly confronted those who doubted the identity of her and her holiness. The last time the ghost was reported in Sullivan was mid-August, when it followed was followed by a procession of 48 people from the Blaisdell basement to a neighbor's home a half a mile away. And when she knocked on the door, so there's a physical manifestation in that. The person came out and face to face with Nellie, and she confronted him and called him a skeptic and showed him, "You have said that I cannot leave the basement, for I am a fraud, so I have come to you." At the end of that night, she appeared before a crowd in the field, and stood there. She didn't say a word. And then she expanded and vanished and was never seen again. Quite a weird tale.
Very much. Yeah.
Yeah, these are stories that I think people should hear, that they never make it. One of my big pet peeves for everybody is that I hate when you get a book and, like, say it's haunted North Carolina, haunted, with Wisconsin or whatever, and you get the same tired stories over and over again. Like, if you go to Pennsylvania, there's only 6 places haunted. Sorry, that's just all there is. Because every book has those places, because it's easy. The research is already done. And these stories are huge stories. They're amazing stories. And the research isn't already done. So, I mean, like, obviously I pulled sources and things like that, but I actually went in and verified pieces of the stories to make sure that it was right, and make corrections where needed. Our next one's called Wheatland's Plantation. And it's also referred to as the Carnton Plantation. Let me explain. So this is in Franklin, Tennessee. And it's actually in a place called Sevier County. Now, the stories from the Wheatland plantation are woven into the history of the place. They involve the spirits of slaves, of Revolutionary War soldiers, of a strange murder, and so much more. So let's get started. The haunting at Wheatlands is attributed to being because of the violence of so many people having died there. On the property, there are 28 Cherokee who were buried after the Battle of Boyd's Creek. And I wanted to go into this a little bit. So basically, the Cherokee Indians, so during the American Revolution, the French and the British attempted to get the Native American people on their side. And both groups did, and they made treaties and pacts and promised these great things and what have you. And the British had gotten the Cherokee committed to them. And so this battle ensues, and 28 Cherokees are killed in the battle. And they're buried on the edge of the property. Now, there were slaves on the plantation, and there are about 50 graves in a cemetery that belong to the slaves who were on the plantation. And, they died of various things. They died from old age, from illness, lots of different things, accidents, things like that. There is the story of a murder. Now, the story as I originally read it said that the man murdered his son with a cast iron poker, a fire poker, and that the bloodstains of the incident are still visible in the parlor. So I did some research because I wanted to know, why would a man murder his son? And did any of this actually happen? So I wanted to tell you that's the story, but here's the truth. The story surrounding the Wheatland plantation does not indicate that a father killed his son. It actually was the opposite. So, in the historical account, the son, John Chandler, killed his father, Timothy. Now, Timothy, Chandler's mother, the estate owner, left the property to her grandson rather than to her son, because she didn't trust her son to be fiscally responsible. And so after the will was read, Timothy was furious because he was sure he was getting the plantation and all of the money, and he found out that his son had inherited it instead. He attacked John, and a royal battle ensued, and to save his own life, John had to strike his father. And that is how that happened. And they do say that there's bloodstains in the room where this occurred. Now, people have also reported that they hear phantom sounds of the murder, like the fighting and the yelling and all of that replaying. And during the American Civil War, John Chandler was the owner of 188 slaves. The plantation was a significant holding, and people produced crops like wheat, honey, potatoes, sweet potatoes, things like that. They had a distillery called making something called wheat whiskey that was shipped to New Orleans. And after the Civil War, I'm just going to give you the facts. John Chandler paid his former enslaved workers a living wage, and they stayed with him. And upon his death in 1875, they inherited parts of the property, forming the Chandler Gap community, a predominantly African American settlement that persisted well into the 20th century. The plantation also is associated with a story about witchcraft and voodoo. So there's a story of a woman named Granny Jane. She was a formerly enslaved woman who stayed as a free woman, and she practiced voodoo, and it is believed that her spirit protects the house from intruders. She was apparently very fond of John, and John treated her very well. And as she got older, he paid caregivers to care for her. She plays a very important role in the historical connection between voodoo and some of the other sightings that appear. So we're going to go into that. So as I said about the Cherokee, they're not the only battle that took place on that ground. So there's the Battle of Boyd's Creek, December 16th of 1780 in, again, Revolutionary War period in Tennessee. Now, Colonel John Sevier, who's the person who the county's now named for, came across this group of Indians, and they had a huge fight. He did bury every one of them in a grave and mark them at the time. The battle site is commemorated. You can do something called the Boyd's Creek Highway history thing, and you can definitely, check this out if you want to go see something more about it. Now, the property, they see Revolutionary War soldiers. They don't see very many Native. A couple stories of Native Americans. They hear an old woman talking. They will see a young woman running, and then, of course, the haunting from the murder. But it's an interesting site with a ton of history, and I wanted to share that with you. Now, this next story was also one of these stories that got mixed up. And I will tell you, because I've written a lot of books, that one of the things that frustrates me the most as an author is when somebody gets a hold of my stories and then they jumble them all up. And they put in a bunch of stuff in there that's not supposed to be in there, because I really work hard, and I do a bibliography for every book to let you know where my sources came from. So I want to tell you the story as it actually happened. This Carlton. It's called Carnton, Carn, Carnton Plantation. And it had a great deal to do with the American Civil War, at least a battle of the American Civil War. And it's probably should be much more well known, because I'm going to tell you in a little bit how large this battle was. So it's a red brick federal style residence. It had 11 rooms in it, and it was built in 1826 by Randall McGavock, who built it on a limestone foundation, and his family lived in it for quite a while. Now, it was one of those beautiful, big, white, ornate mansions with the cedars going down both sides of the driveway, very antebellum. To the one side of it, I believe it's the northwest side of the home, you will see a 2-acre family cemetery. This is just one of the most tragic stories, and there's more death on this site than most places, person for person, of the American Civil War. So there were 1,750 men who lost their lives in the Battle of Franklin. More than 3,000, or excuse me, more than 300 were treated. 150 died right on the grounds. On the first night alone, 4 Confederate generals' bodies were laid out for a few hours after the battle ended on the back porch. On November 30th of 1864, all of this begins. The Confederate Army of Tennessee is viciously assaulted by the Federal Army in the Federal Army trenches along the southern edge of Franklin, Tennessee. This would become, not my estimation, historians' estimation, one of the bloodiest hours of the Civil War. It involved massive frontal assaults larger than Pickett's charge in Gettysburg. Anybody who's ever seen or understood what Pickett's charge was would understand why that's significant. Now, the majority of the battle was close quarters fighting after the sun had started to set. For 5 hours, 9,500 soldiers were killed, wounded, captured, or counted as missing in action. Nearly 7,000 of that 9,500 were the Confederate troops who were massacred there. Afterward, the injured were treated right inside the Carnton plantation home, staining the floors with blood, and it's literally there forever. In right outside of Gettysburg, there is a place where it was a field hospital, and visible to the naked eye, you don't have to use anything. You can see where somebody had been leaning against the wall right inside the door of what would have been the parlor, and they had their hand down on the floor to steady themselves. And you can to this day see the bloody, dried, it's black now, handprint of this person there. And I am fortunate to have friends who know how to get things like luminol and use them appropriately. And so the house was luminol by some friends of mine. And you would not believe the amount of blood that is still in those floors and walls. It was everywhere. It had to be like that. It just simply had to be like that. So I'm not shocked that there are these dark, dried puddles. And no matter how much you scrub or scrape or whatever, it just doesn't go away. And I can imagine all of that. Now, the McGavick's home had become a field hospital, and the heaviest stains were found in the southern facing bedrooms, because those were the operating rooms, and they would literally saw off limbs and throw them out the window, and there would be piles of limbs to be carted away and burned.
Yeah.
300 men were brought to the house within the first night, and half of those 300 men died inside the house. In 1866, 2 acres of the plantation were designated as the final resting place for the Confederate soldiers, and each soldier cost $5 to bury. The entire cost was borne by the citizens of the area of Franklin, and they paid for it within 18 months. That's a lot of money back then, and they were devastated by the war. So it took them a while, but they buried every one of them and paid for it. The Carleton family, or the Carnton family sold it to in 1911 to another family, and we're going to go ahead and talk about that. This family took over they purchased it from Susie Lee, who was one of the McGavick's wives. She was the widow who owned the property, and she sold it because it was just getting to be too much for her to handle. The place is on the National Register of Historic Places. In 1977, the home and all of its 10 acres were donated to the Carnton Association, and it has since been restored and renewed. Artifacts from the McGavick family are still there, and it is the final resting place of 1,500 Confederate soldiers. Interestingly enough, there are books written by the McGavicks, in a journal, and it's basically a plot map, trying to say where every soldier was buried, and to the best of their ability, identify them or give some sort of identifying feature, if it was at all possible, so that families could someday go and look for their loved ones. And that happened in the midst of all of this insanity, that somebody took the time and trouble to try to set this in play so that somewhere down the line people could come for their dead. Uh, that took a great deal of work. Now, at the home, it's not all horrible. Um, Mischievous spirits are reported there. The curator says that they hear noises coming particularly from the enclosed back porch, and she will hear them all the time. She'll go down, she'll investigate, and there's nothing. She talks about one particular instance where she had heard noises on the back porch. She knew she was alone in the house. The porch it's enclosed, so it was locked. And she went into the room to see what had happened, and two panes of glass that had been on a shelf were taken down gently and lifted over to the door where they were going to replace two cracked frames of glass and laid out on the ground right below them, as if to say, I think you need to get this done now. And she said, I do think it's the spirit of the girl who runs through the house. There's a young girl who's also seen, separate one. There's a young girl who's also seen in the kitchen. She was also said to have been murdered by a jealous suitor when she rejected him, and she's still scrubbing the floors and, cleaning the house. And this happens a lot, particularly late summer, early fall, that they see her. And I wanted to share a couple instances. So at dusk one October, some visitors came to the place, and they saw a woman floating effortlessly across the back porch, the big glass doors, it's all glassed in. There were spirits of fallen soldiers moving through the fields. Different people have seen them. There was a Confederate general who has also been seen pacing the front porch, just back and forth. There's the floating head of a cook. I know this sounds crazy. I could find nothing about a murder or death or anything like that, but there's the floating head of a cook who worked for the family during the Civil War. She's spotted floating through the hallway and down to the kitchen. She's also heard bustling around in the kitchen, making noise as though she's still cooking. There are a few Native American spirits, as I said. Weirdly enough, there's really no way to explain. They're seen in the house. They're never seen on the grounds. They're seen in the house. I don't know why. Nobody seems to. There is one story, though, that I think is really important. So there was a gentleman, the author doesn't give his full name, just Mr. P. And Mr. P was a descendant of a person who had gone and had fought at the Battle of Franklin. So he decided to go, kind of learn some family history and pay his homage there. So he traveled to the Carnton Mansion, but by the time he got there, it was 5 o'clock and they had already locked up. It was a beautiful fall evening, and so he decided to just kind of walk around the outside of the place and, walk the path up to the mansion itself and just soak in the history, the atmosphere, close his eyes for a moment, imagine what it must have been like with all those thousands of people in the battle and all of that. As he gets close to the house, he sees a man in silhouette, and he could have swore he saw the guy beside with a horse beside him. And as he looks harder, it's beginning to get a little dusky. And he says to the guy, as he gets close to him, was there a horse there? And at that point, a man sitting on the porch whom he did not see says to him, no, son, that horse was shot out from under him, just like my horse was shot out from me under me earlier. And the other man is now gone. The man that was standing where he thought the horse had been. So he says to this man, are you reenactors? And the man laughs and he said, I don't know what that is. And he conversed with the soldier, and he asked them about the battle. He said, I came here, I have a relative that fought here, and I wanted to know more about it. And how they put it in the article is the spirits gave him a peek at the harsh world of the fight his ancestor had been through. And his ancestor survived, by the way. And he turned and he left the ground and um, never came back. He reached out by phone to tell them this crazy story, and he just said, I wanted to let you know what I had seen and what I had experienced. He said at the time he was very calm. It was only later that he began to shake and, be agitated. He said he had no fear. It didn't seem frightening in any way. There are lots of people who are seen moving around the battlefield area and along the grounds. There's the trotting of ghostly horses around the property. There's just a ton of history that is there. I highly recommend it as a place to go. So we're going to move on, do one more, and then we'll finish. I'll add a story to next week's, and we'll finish next week. This one is called the Wilson House in Seabrook, New Jersey. And it's just a fascinating little story. Here we go. It was called the Spy House of Portsmouth, New Jersey. Now, the house, I'm gonna do this a little different than I normally do. So these are the stories that are normally told about the house, and then I'm going to tell you what the truth is. So the commonly reported stories is that there's a woman in white who is said to wander the rooms. There's supposed to be a small boy who's seen peering out the windows, an elderly bearded sea captain who roams the halls and the grounds, who is, according to legend, the notorious pirate Captain Morgan. I don't know if he's the Captain Morgan that made the rum.
I say I enjoyed his rum back when I
As good as,
would partake.
yes, I
Mhm.
like the cherry rum better, but that's cool. Um, anyway, he is said to have used the basement of the house as a torture chamber and hidden treasures. I don't know. Pirates just like they like to steal things, I guess, because they never kept them. They just buried them and then they lose them. It's hilarious. So in total, there's supposed to be 22 active hauntings, ghosts on the property. And now the truth. There was a director of the facility, the property, the historical site, named Gertrude Niedlinger. She was there for about 20, 25 years. She was 1970s to 1980s. At that point in time, a lot of people were beginning to pay attention to ghost stories and also to history a little more than they had for a long time. And she wanted to save the property. This is not the only story of this, so I think it's a very believable story. I have seen it for myself and actually investigated several properties. In fact, there's a property, the haunted site in the Altoona area that this happened to. So basically what happened is she created events that didn't happen. So I'm going to tell you the real stories. She did so because she wanted people to be interested enough that they'd be willing to donate money to help protect the property. Because I guess New Jersey, much like Pennsylvania, doesn't really support their historical sites. A lot of it's done through raising funds privately, grants from benefactors, things like that. They don't have any real help. If you have a property that you want to protect because you feel it has historical significance, get out with your tin cup and get moving because that's what's going to have to happen. I work and I'm associated with Fort Bedford in Bedford, Pennsylvania. And let me tell you, the people there work tirelessly to keep that building afloat and to make it better. They literally do spend time redoing all the repairs on their own. They raise funds and what have you. So if you have a historic site in your area, like, go spend a little time, a little bit of money, because it may not be there in 20 years if you don't. So here's the original history. The house was built as a little cabin by a guy by the name of Thomas Whitlock, who came to America in 1650. It was a one-room little structure and was later expanded, supposedly during the Revolutionary War, where its then owner, Thomas Seabrook, allegedly spied on British troops and relayed plans to the colonial forces. That's why it was called a spy house. However, that's not the truth either. So here we go. So Seabrook family, actually were patriots. Thomas Seabrook served as a lieutenant colonel in the Patriot militia, and there is no documentation that the house was ever used for espionage. The house's strategic location on Sandy Hook Bay would make it a potential target for British forces, but it was not ever in the historical record a tavern. And he was, frankly, during the American Revolution, kind of busy being a soldier. So we don't think that that part is true. There were no inns listed there until the 1960s. Much of that story isn't true. However, that said, the house actually stayed really with the Seabrook family for 250 years. And it was expanded several times by different family members as they ended up inhabiting the property. And there are many stories of a man being seen in the house, and most likely Mr. Seabrook. There are also stories of the house being haunted by a woman, probably one of the Seabrook women. There is no grand history, but what makes this story really important to tell, and why I chose to tell it today, is because so many of the things that we're seeing, and it's getting so much worse with AI and the ability for everybody to write. It's not that I think that I'm better or smarter or anything else, but you really do have to have an eye for history, and you have to be willing to dig. I will sometimes have 1,500 pages for a 300-page book, 1,500 pages of documentation, because I want to make sure the stories are true when I tell them to you. And even then, I make mistakes. I'm human. Um, but I wanted to share it because if you know history or you want to protect history, come help us. And don't ever believe everything you read is exactly the way it is. I literally spent a couple days off and on, and when I had the opportunity to try to piece this together, and I'd hit that and it'd say, oh, this is the story. So then I'd ask more questions and it would say, oh, no, that's not true. This is what's true. And I chased it down for a couple days. So I finally got to the historical records. So that might not be our best ghost story, but I do have something to promise you. The last few stories, I promise you, are going to be extremely insane. There's going to be highwaymen, a banshee,
Oh,
and all kinds of craziness going on. So tune in for next week, and we will finish these houses that you should know the history of and the hauntings. And let's see where else we go. So with that, I am going to tell everybody that I hope you have a wonderful night, and I'll talk to you next week.
well, then I should say good night so you can say good night.
That's why I did it that way. I usually say good night, and then you'll say, well, she already had the last word. So tonight you have to say it first.
So, good night.
Good night, everybody.